Prime Time's latest portal potpourri behind the scenes at the draft. What happened to Pete Thamel's voice and how Nick Saban fared behind the scenes, and the latest on the future of college football, including potential revenue sharing. This is the College Game Day podcast for Tuesday, May 7th. Rece Davis, Pete Thamel, reunited. And if I may go all Chris Berman on the people for just a moment, as Peaches and Herb would say, reunited and it feels so good. I don't know why I did that. That just kind of came to me. Pete, great to see you. We've communicated a little bit. I want to start with Colorado today, but first of all, and we'll get into the draft. But before that, how are the pipes? How's the
pipes
voice?
Are good. The pipes are
good.
back.
Excellent.
The pipes are as good as as my pipes will be. I think that's probably the safest way to say it. I lost my voice somewhere on the flight to Detroit somehow, some way. I didn't particularly feel bad, but it obviously showed up. I'm still getting text messages, or an AD or a coach will answer or call me. How's your voice? Your voice okay? How's your voice? Your voice okay?
Caleb Williams' family has been planning for this since he was recruited. In 2019, they told all the schools that were recruiting him, give us a plan to be the number one pick in the 2024 draft.
I want to give the listeners a secret. If you ever need to talk and your voice disappears, there's something called singer's spray. I am neither a singer nor someone who really has needed his pipes until this juncture in my career. And I went to the 9th mile of Detroit, 1 mile past the 8th, and there was a natural food store, family owned. It was a really cool little spot, and bought a big old bushel of Singer's spray and hawked it on my throat and got through it. So cheers to those who advised me on Singer's spray, because there's a whole world of people who talk for a living who have to adjust when they can't talk, and I learned a lot about it. And yeah, a lot of cough drops. But no, it was good. Everybody was good, sort of helped me through, and passing on some advice. Mike Greenberg had a lot of thoughts, and he was very generous with them. Warm water, not cold. And then the throat coat tea. So anyway.
The throat coat tea, it's a yogi tea, is key. I also recommend honey and lemon juice. I tried some of it. I didn't really have a problem, but you shared some of that, gave me a bottle of that Singer spray stuff, because apparently you bought out the store. So I'll be keeping that on hand. Sometimes I opt for trying to convince the doctor to give you one of those quick steroid dose packs. I wouldn't pass a performance enhancing drug test sometimes, but sometimes that'll reduce the swelling long enough to let you get through the assignment. So we'll talk a little bit more about the draft and some other things coming up. But it seems to be that this time of year that the Colorado Buffaloes make their way to the forefront. It was not a beautiful day at all for their spring game. Still had a good crowd, a lot of rain there. But off the field is where the attention and the news continues to be generated. The most recent thing, about a week or so ago, was the back and forth on social media from a defensive back, Xavier Smith, who had transferred away, and saying some things about Deion. Shadur went at him and called him mid, and then Deion sort of amplified the whole thing with just sort of a fairly, at least in terms of verbiage, innocuous tweet, but it called attention to this situation. It calls to mind something, Pete. I mean, there are a couple things to look at this. First of all, what does it mean for the long-term significance, and whether Colorado is going to be successful long-term using this type of approach, the one that Deion Sanders has? And I think the other one is the dilemma that we face in the media sometimes. We want coaches to be candid and honest and give us their true personalities. Yet sometimes when we do, we criticize it. However, people say that, and then they dismiss that as if you should never criticize. I get that from a lot of my former player coach colleagues. However, it is incumbent on you. You can want both things. These things are not mutually exclusive. You can want the coach to be candid, and I do. You can also, when he is candid, if you disagree with what is being said or the tone of what is being said, or whether it engaged in the proper decorum to say it, that can be critiqued too. And then the coach gets to decide if he wants to continue to be candid. So let's start with the thing that probably interests our listeners the most. Ramifications from this. How sustainable is this? Is there an impact at all with the number of former players who have some type of beef about the way they exited Colorado, or the number of talented players and some of their big portal gets or recruiting gets from last year who have decided to leave?
Yeah, I think Colorado, again, Rece, will be the most interesting program in college football, right? Like they have continued to be relentlessly fascinating. And I certainly am never one to say, oh, a coach shouldn't speak his mind or a coach shouldn't say that. I agree with you 100% that we should let coaches be unfiltered and interesting. And that is what Deion has been. Now, the tenor of some of this stuff, in the way it's come off, hasn't reflected great on Deion. And I think it goes back to a little bit of one of the main topics we talked about a year ago. And I think this was your point that I may be co-opting, is that let's see how Deion handles adversity. Like that was always a question that we had. Okay, you can win signing day and you can, have the spring game and you can have all of the pop culture and all the guys on the sideline. But what happens when things don't go well? And for all of Colorado's improvement from 1 win to 4 wins, they were still a 1-8 conference team last year. Is that right? The Pac-12 plays 9 conference games, and they ended the season on a long losing streak. So, with all the, and then they had another complete roster turnover, and they've, no matter what they want to say, they lost some good players. Dylan Edwards is a good player. Alton McCaskill had been a really good player at.
He was all conference at Houston, right?
Yes. I mean, he was the rookie of the year in the AAC. They have 5 new starters on the offensive line. They have Travis Hunter is going to moonlight at receiver still, but they have some huge voids to fill there. So I'm very curious to see how this reload goes, because their schedule, Rece, is going to be, a lot different. I think it's a completely different Nebraska program that they play early in the year than we saw last year. And it's actually going to be an interesting test case for Colorado early in the year. Well, first of all, they open with North Dakota State, and the associate athletic director who scheduled that game whoever scheduled that game should be fired. All right. That is just a negligent, horrible athletic department decision. All right. You do not schedule an FCS game you can lose. You just don't do it. Now, North Dakota State might not have been what they were 3 or 4 years ago, but they're still excellent. And they are going to be sound, and they are going to have the great, still sort of mid-major competitive advantage if we were talking about college basketball, and that's continuity, right? Now, sure, if they lost some guys to transfer, absolutely, but North Dakota State is a program. It is a solid program. They do have a new coach coming in this year, but that is a game that whoever scheduled that 8 years ago or whatever, whoever they are, should be shaking their boots, because that is just. That's going to be very interesting. Tim Polasek, longtime Iowa O-line coach, had been the OC at Wyoming. He had been at North Dakota State before that. He debuts as the North Dakota State head coach. Matt Entz went to USC as an assistant last year. So I think that's fascinating. And then you go right from that, you go to Lincoln, and it is the test case of turnover versus continuity. There was, toward the end of the portal, I saw a stat that Nebraska had not lost any players to the portal this spring. And I do think that I've seen 1 or 2 in there since. But generally speaking, and I actually would watch their spring game last week, they have a ton of returning starters on the offensive line. Dylan Raiola looked really good in their spring game. They have a huge uptick in talent at receiver. That really, really popped in their spring game. So you have a program that's grown and been built through continuity. And then you have a program that is basically spinning all the way through. And I'm going to stop babbling here, but the whole coaching staff is essentially new again at Colorado.
It's different, yeah. New coordinators on both sides. Although Pat Shermer took over at the end of the season, Charles Kelly left and went to Auburn. He was a defensive coordinator there. Sean Lewis, as we know, was the offensive coordinator when they were putting up big numbers early. Took the head coaching job at San Diego State after he was demoted midseason. So They've got a young defensive coordinator. I think Robert Livingston, correct me if I'm wrong on the name of the things, right? Former NFL assistant with the Bengals. So there is a lot of change, and they couldn't stop anyone last year. So that's a major issue as well. They do have some talented guys. Like they have a running back coming in from Ohio State and Dallin Hayden that I remain perplexed. And look, Ryan Day knows his personnel. I'm not trying to criticize, but Dallin Hayden had some really good moments of good games for Ohio State, and I couldn't quite understand why he couldn't quite get footing there. So I think there is a potential for Dallin Hayden, if Colorado's offensive line is better, to really make an impact and maybe take some pressure off of Shedeur Sanders and off of having to get the ball to Travis Hunter, as often as they had to at times, it seemed, last year.
Yeah, fascinating hire there on the O-line. So you have essentially the worst O-line in major college football last year. Shedeur gets sacked, I believe, 52 times. I think Old Dominion actually did give up more sacks than Colorado, but they were atrocious, and he was running scared all year and eventually got hurt, which even hurt them even more. As we've seen, it's hard for Colorado to have a backup quarterback, mainly because Deion came in and insulted most of the ones that were in the room and scared them off. And who wants to go in and back up the coach's son? You're not going to play. So I just feel like that unit, if they are going to make progress from 4-8, it's that unit. They hired a very familiar name, Phil Lodeholt, as their O-line coach. He was a star at Oklahoma, second-round pick by the Vikings, played for a while in the NFL, and he's been an offensive assistant or analyst at a bunch of places. This is his first O-line job. So I think there are a lot of risks on the coaching staff and a lot of unknowns on the coaching staff right now. There's always a risk when you hire a coach that's good or not, but there are just a lot of I'm going to need to see Pat Shurmur call Sean Lewis's offense, because I'm pretty sure when Pat Shurmur was in the NFL, they didn't run an offense like Sean Lewis ran, which is essentially like a 4-vert speed tempo Baylor offense, which, by the way, suited Colorado really well, helped mask their terrible offensive line, and really opened things up for Shedeur Sanders, who has wonderful arm talent and had really, really elite speed at receiver. So it's hard to go into this season bullish in any way on Colorado. You could think they might win 6 games, right? But it's hard to see them taking a leap forward, because there's just been so much turnover and there's so much question, coaching staff wise, roster wise. And the last point I'll make, Rece, is that Deion Sanders, game coaching wise, cost them 2 games last year. They had a 29-point lead in the second half against Stanford. They did not run the ball. They did not bleed the clock. It was poor game management. And then in the halftime before Oregon State, they simply failed to manage the clock properly and handed Oregon State a touchdown going into halftime. And those are the types of things that, as Deion Sanders evolves as a coach, he needs to get better at.
Last thing that I have on the way guys are dismissed or encouraged to move on. There are a lot of different ways to do it. This is not new. This is not something Deion Sanders invented to send players moving on. This has happened since the beginning of time. Coaches do this. Are there ways that don't offend the sensibilities of the public as much? Sure. But I noticed that one of the players said that, he didn't sugarcoat much. He just told you the way it is. And, I've pointed this out several times on this podcast. Deion ain't hard to find. He also ain't easy to play for, because he's a tough dude. He's a hard-nosed, old school Mickey Andrews, the former Florida State assistant disciple. He's a tough guy. So he's not going to be easy to play for. Doesn't make all of his decisions right. It doesn't make all of the public things, sort of denigrating players, even if that's not your full intention. That's the result of it a little bit. And, I think he could improve in that area, because I don't think that's generally who he is, but he's gotten sideways in that regard, as we all do from time to time. And I think Shedeur did too. I admire, there's a part of me that admires Shedeur stepping up and defending his father, online. And then there's also a part of me that thinks, okay, if you are a potential very high draft pick, if you are the face of the program, if you are one of the faces of college football, and if you think someone is an average player based on his tweet, let it go. It's okay to let it go every now and then. That's not weakness, that's strength. Why are you giving a person that you don't have that respect for that type of power by responding to them? I think that might be the wiser course of action, but that's probably a matter of opinion. Let's wrap Colorado here. If you had to set the over-under in there, Big 12 is really hard to assess because it's so new and because the two juggernauts are gone.
College football is really hard to assess now. Because
like it's just, I was looking at SMU the other day. They have 20 power conference transfers. Like there's just the familiarity. It's, a lot of laundry changing hands. Anyway, sorry to cut you off.
No. I'm glad you did. That's interjection. As I said to our group, reminded them for the 500th time, and was talking to Nick Saban about chiming in at times and encouraging him to do so. Interjection is conversation. It's interruption that's rude. And by interruption, that means talking and continuing to talk and competing to talk until everybody else hushes, which Nick did not do at all, but he was brilliant interjecting. I digress. Back to Colorado. New Big 12 schedule, or back to the Big 12, back to the future for them. Last year, I remember we did the thing, when would they no longer be relevant on the field? As you said, they're always going to be fascinating. I said end of September. I missed that by a couple of weeks. So let's change the question. Set the over-under wins at, let's say, 5.5. You going over-under?
Looking now, I would take the under on 5.5. Now, Shedeur needs to be said, I texted some NFL guys this morning because I knew we were going to be talking about this. A lot of NFL teams evaluated Shedeur last year because he was draft eligible. And got a couple different responses back, but the thought is he'll be at the top of this quarterback class. He would not have been at the top of the one that just happened. But there is some arm talent, there's some great athleticism, and he's put a lot of plays on tape and really, 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 really carried the ball. Great feel for the game. You can blame a lot of people for 52 sacks, right? But at a certain point, the quarterback's going to get rid of the ball on some of those, right? Like, because some of those he's Bo-Nixing around from his Auburn days, some. And obviously the line stunk. That is plain. So, but he needs to get better in realizing, how to get out of things. So I'm a fan of Shedeur Sanders. I think we're gonna have him in the green room in Green Bay next year. Mm-hmm. But I'm just not as confident on what's around him, especially still up front. So I'm gonna go under.
Yeah, me too. And I think also as you look at their schedule, not that home and road is everything. The biggest win of the year last year was on the road at TCU, but they're at Nebraska, they're at UCF, they're at Arizona. They're at Texas Tech. They're at Kansas, who I think Kansas and Arizona, two of the teams that I think can win the Big 12. I think as difficult as it is to evaluate. So I'm going to go under too. I think they'll be under 5.
Yeah. They have Utah at home. I think Utah wins the Big 12.
That's a solid bet in just about any league Utah plays in. Pick Utah, and you're going to be in the mix until deep November at the very least. You dropped the Green Bay reference. That's where we will be next year for the NFL draft, which will be a scene, I'm sure, but it'll have a lot to live up to match what Detroit was. We talked about your vocal travails a little bit as we started. The draft itself, I think, was really energizing for us at College Game Day because it was sort of the dawn of Nick Saban joining the group. Now, the draft is a completely different animal from College Game Day. College Game Day is, when at its best, almost completely unscripted. It is there's a rundown, a format, parameters, if you will, but it's unscripted. But the draft, you really don't know what's coming next. And, you have Michael Penix drafted and you go. But I thought one of the fascinating things about working with Nick was first his appetite for the television side of it. We know he's a gifted communicator in any forum, but he was very cognizant of wanting to be part of the team, of wanting to fit in and amplify. And he was also aware that while his coaching expertise was valuable, that he also had to think about how it played on television. I'll give you an example without calling a name. And you probably heard this a couple of times in our meeting. He referenced things that perhaps were shortcomings of players who were highly rated in the draft order. And he said, but I'm not sure about saying this on TV. So afterwards, he and I talked a little bit, and, I'm not trying to take any credit for this, but I encouraged him to look for ways to say it, because those are the things that we need to hear from the greatest college coach of all time. And then I felt as if he could do it in a way that wouldn't, sort of rain on the player's draft day, which is something that he was cognizant of, which I think showed great feel. And feel is really important, for television. Feel for the guys that you're on the set with, feel for how things are going to go home. And I was really impressed that he found the ways to make the criticisms, which showed his honesty, but did it in such a way that not necessarily just emphasize the player's strong suit, but saying, this is the area. This is the area that he needs to work on. He's got great talent. He's got a chance to be a great player. If he's going to be what he can be, he needs to work on, X, Y, and Z. He's a little stiff in the ankles. He needs to do this. He doesn't come out of his breaks the way we'd like right now, but he can. He's got to work on that. He did it. He did it in such a way that didn't make him seem like, here's the coach up here, and I'm going to break down everybody, because that's what you do in the recruiting room. There are a few guys that you go, well, we've got to have him, and every human has shortcomings, but there are a few players that you don't worry about that. But when you're recruiting, you always go, he referenced an and but guy. You always reference the but. Now he was talking more off the field, but you always reference what could go wrong. What's a shortcoming? What's the thing? That's how you approach it. And, I thought between that and in a commercial break, when they brought snacks around because it was late on Friday night and we were all getting punchy and we were tired, and he just looked and he goes, where are the oatmeal cream pies? It also showed the power of Saban that those were produced very quickly.
Yeah. I may have heard that in my ears in the truck and got him going to some of the folks to bring him up there. So, because I was on the ears at that point. My voice may not have worked, but I had some common sense to know what to do. You could tell a little piece of his soul was dying with no defensive players going until what was it, 15th, 14th? That was, and he had the great line about, this is why I retired.
Exactly. It was funny. And I hope we get some stories that we got behind the scenes. And I do not want to, steal the thunder. It was just a tremendous one that he shared on Wednesday night. But this intertwining of NIL and moving and sometimes leads to relationships away from the football field between even coaches and players on opposing teams. He had really fascinating ones that I hope over the course of time in game day that he'll share. And he's going to be just a tremendous addition. Got a very nice text from Miss Terry that glad to be part of the team. One last thing about that. We'll move on to your hardcore, serious investigative reporting on the revenue sharing model. When the oatmeal cream pies at Little Debbie's came up, our producer, Jim Galliero, really, you want to develop the relationship with the new guy on the set. And Jim gets in my ear and says, do you think you'll get mad if we show him eating an oatmeal cream pie on television? And I said, nah, just do it. I said, I'll eat one too. And before long, I think we were all chowing down. So anyway, that's good. So he did mention that he had never been given a single box of free oatmeal cream pies, despite the publicity that he's given them, which is stunning. He eats 2 every morning for breakfast, every morning, 2 every morning, and still no freebies, which leads us to the entire NIL world and revenue sharing and the deep desire to settle this House case to mitigate some of the financial damage. It's the House versus NCAA. You can explain this thoroughly, but in layman's terms, rough outline, sued the NCAA. There are players seeking back pay from times when they were restricted from their earnings. And the estimates are that this, if not settled, could cost $4 billion. There are a lot of layers. I got some calls about some things that we'll get to in a second. But revenue sharing, short of making the players employees, seems to be the one that's gaining some traction in terms of a potential resolution. Is that an accurate way to look at it?
Yes. So I just want to warn that this is complex, right? And there's a court case.
House versus NCAA, but it's really House versus the NCAA and the power conferences. All right. And the key turning point of why this is back in the news came, I guess it was 2 weeks ago now, on a Thursday. There were CFP meetings in Dallas, and then with all the commissioners there, Kessler, Berman, and the lawyers from the plaintiff side came in to Dallas, and NCAA officials, Charlie Baker, NCAA lawyers, all came into Dallas. There were about 20 people in a room at the Hyatt in Dallas, and they basically hammered out a potential framework of what settling this case could look like. And after we reported that, the details of the settlement started to trickle out. The key detail is that it would cost the NCAA over the next 10 years, $2.7 billion was the number that we heard. Again, these numbers aren't final because they're still kind of being talked about, negotiated, et cetera. But in a way, the NCAA carrying that freight for back damages paves the way for the conferences to start a revenue sharing moving forward. There are still many looming issues, Rece, but I think the two biggest ones, you hit on one of them. One is, do you still need congressional help to hammer out some type of employment status agreement, right? And back in February, when we first kind of dove into the settlement talk, it was right after the Big Ten and SEC announced their alliance, non-alliance. There was a quote we used on ESPN.com that basically said, Congress doesn't want to save us, they want to help us. And all the congressional things with those 10 hearings and whatever, those were all like, save us, Congress. This is like, okay, this is what we're doing. This is how we're settling it. This is allegedly peace on the horizon moving forward. Can Congress come in now and accentuate what we're doing as opposed to just wholesale saving us? So, but the other thing too is the athletes were not in that room in Dallas, and the athletes are going to have a seat at the table. They're going to have a stake. You've long said this on this podcast, and I agree with that completely. So there are myriad other small details that are going, big details, by the way, but like lesser significance details that are going to have to be hashed out. Where do collectives fit? Do they go in house? Can you still have, if your rev share is about a $20 million cap that's been talked about, can you still have a collective that gives extra money to people? So say your quarterback makes $1 million from the school, just hypothetical numbers. Can, it's Riley Leonard at Notre Dame. Can Riley Leonard still make another $1 million from the collective? Or is the cap a cap? Is it a soft cap or a leaky cap or hard cap? Because that collective world has been born, killing it off is just like in one swoop is going to be difficult. Like these are lives and peoples and families and such. So if there were an easy solution to the future of college sports, we would have had it long ago. It was always going to be murky. It was always going to be complex. And there's 3 or 4 other sort of looming variables, Rece, that are still going to go out there. But that's a basic 101 of where things are for settlement. And I think the last thing I want to make sure I add is like, why are they settling? The NCAA is like over $1 billion in lawsuits. They have just gotten murdered in court. And it is one of the great failures of Mark Emmert's tenure as NCAA president, which was hallmarked by failures, that they never realized this and adjusted. They just kept lining up and kept getting mowed down, Donald Remy was their counsel, and they just kept taking ill-advised appearances in courts and getting slaughtered. So this is a way to say, and I guess the last thing is like, what everyone wants is a settlement that gives you a decade or so of protection from more lawsuits. Now, if it's an antitrust settlement, you'd have to think there's some protection from an antitrust lawsuit. But those details aren't been hashed out yet. And then there's also other potential lawsuits. So they want a halo over college sports for a little bit time of peace and tranquility for presumably the next decade, which is how long the NCAA would be paying off that $2.7 billion debt.
I hope congressional involvement is minimal, because I live by the axiom that was put forth many, many years ago. The 9 most feared words in the English language are "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." So I hope that we don't have to deal with that. And secondly, because you know that I am a classic TV aficionado. And
you are. You watch Perry Mason every night.
I love Perry Mason, and it's as if the NCAA is represented by Hamilton Berger, who was the opposing attorney. Can you imagine being that actor? Because back then, before people really separated, and I don't know that I've ever seen that guy in anything else, but people just thought of him as the guy who always got his eyes beat shut in court. That he was always the losing guy. It's as if the NCAA is represented by him. The other thing that I got several calls on was when UAB, Trent Dilfer's players all went with the, what was it? Is it athletes.org? Is that the name of it or something like that? Yeah. Athletes.org, which is basically a group that would unionize / negotiate for them. There were people up in arms that this was somehow going to undermine the work that had been done that you talked about a little bit. And, I don't think this is going to hinge on what the UAB players do, but I do also understand that from UAB, it gives them the appearance of getting out front a little bit. Maybe, I always look for, maybe it's my old school look. Everything in college sports is about recruiting. So while those things don't have to be mutually exclusive, you can believe, as I'm sure Trent Dilfer does from his days in the NFL Players Association, about the players having a right to negotiate. You can believe all those things. Doesn't hurt to be perceived as the guy who's out front fighting for the players.
Nope. Sure doesn't.
Yeah.
Remember Steve Spurrier was always like ahead of the pay the players bandwagon.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Recruiting.
People, and I'll leave you with this story. A good friend of mine who's a coach, and I don't have many of those in coaching, was recruiting, and he said he was going to meet a potential transfer, and he goes, the way things are these days, he said, I might as well just meet him at Bank of America, or the bank of his choosing. I might as well just meet him wherever, it's just and everything was legal, nothing illegal. He was just, sort of making a snide reference. Okay, last thing before we wrap up. What are you doing non-work related over the next week or so? Tell me something you're doing non-work related.
We're going to celebrate Kate Thamel for Mother's Day this weekend. That's for certain, right? Teddy Thamel's got some 2-year-old Teddy's got some good fun stuff up his sleeve to give to mom to thank her for her diligence. And the other thing we have a Peloton treadmill now, Rece. So I'm trying to get my old body in a little bit of shape before we do 22 straight game days this fall. So I've been seeing our friend Jess Sims on screen and occasionally cursing at her.
Yeah. Do you like the tread better than the bike?
It was like a mix it up a little bit. I've had the bike since like 18. So it's just like a little bit of like, different things. So I've been watching spring games while on the treadmill. Just pick one a day, flip it on and watch until I'm tired. So can't say I watch all 4 quarters or whatever.
Yeah, I can't do that because when I work out, I don't listen to music. Well, I do it generally, maybe occasionally. Maybe if I'm following a Peloton video or something like that, whether it's, on the bike or off, I just have to concentrate on that. I feel like that if I'm on a treadmill, on a bike, and I'm watching something else, then I lose some intensity. So I
definitely lose intensity.
I can't do it. I can't do it. So I have to separate. I have to compartmentalize. Pete, I'm glad the pipes are better. So we'll continue to do this in the off season. We're going to continue or resume our visits from various college coaches around the country. We had a few on before the NFL draft. We'll pick that up in the days and weeks ahead. Thanks for listening to the College Game Day podcast. We encourage you to download this wherever you prefer to get your podcast, or better yet, subscribe. That is a much better idea.